what I'm talking about is really population-wide cultural shifts in certain behaviours and certain lifestyles.
Hello and welcome. This is Lockdown TV from UnHerd. Professor Susan Michie is one of the leading proponents here in the UK of an activist policy in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. She sits on the all-important SAGE committee that advises the government. She is a psychologist by training and director of the Centre for Behaviour Change, I believe, at University College London. Hello, Susan.
Hello, and I should say that I'm speaking in my personal capacity.
Quite right. Thank you for sharing the time and talking to us today.
Pleasure.
So let's start with a little brouhaha that happened last week. You were asked whether some policies like masks and social distancing should remain for a long time, and you said you thought perhaps they should remain forever. What did you mean?
I actually used 4 words, and only one of them was reported. The 4 words I used were forever to some extent. Now, what I mean by this is that sadly, this isn't going to be the last pandemic. I was also on SAGE in 2009 in our last pandemic, the H1N1 pandemic. And for as long as humans are around, viruses are going to be around, and they're clever. So I think the issue is, what have we learnt? What can we do differently as a society that means that when inevitable outbreaks occur, when there's a new viral threat, that we can behave in such a way as to minimise the chance of a pandemic happening at all, or if it does happen, of making it as short and least destructive as possible. And my own field is, my own area of expertise and interest is behaviour. And in fact, I led on a paper for SAGE on maintaining behaviours in the long term, which hasn't yet been published. And there are things that we can do that will minimise not only the chance of getting infected by this kind of virus, but all viruses in the long term.
So what would that mean? So next pandemic comes along, COVID-22, God forbid, but what would you like to see happen then?
Well, what I'm talking about is really population-wide cultural shifts in certain behaviours and certain lifestyles. When I was a child, myself, everybody I knew, we always washed our hands before we sat down to eat. Sadly, my children and my grandchildren do not do this anymore. But just as you can lose population-wide behaviours, so you can gain them. And people in other countries do still do that. So that's an example. We also know in other societies, I went on a work visit to Japan several years ago, and I was amazed at the fact that they were so frequently wearing masks. I really didn't understand it, and I was, asking about it. And from their point of view, they just regard it as good manners, to wear masks if they're in enclosed spaces, or if somebody's got a cough, or if they've got a sniffle, but generally they wear them. Now, I'm not saying that we should all adopt that, but what I was saying is I think it's a good idea to keep these behaviours that we can turn on or off as needed.
And social distancing you would include in that list?
I don't think anybody has enjoyed the experiences of commuting where you're crowded together with other people in public transport, for example. I think it would be a really good idea if we could redesign cities, redesign transport in such a way that there wasn't so much crowding in indoor spaces. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about, is just taking, the miserable almost 18 months now that we've been through, and thinking about, none of us ever want to go through another lockdown. How can we best prevent us being in that situation again? And, what I suppose the message is that if at a population-wide level, we can all do some things differently. For example, in the States, I notice when they cough, there's a really common way of coughing. And also, I think in the Netherlands, I've seen it, where people cough into the crook of their elbow. Much better than coughing or sneezing onto your hands that you then touch other surfaces, people touch, etc. So there's these small things that, when I say we could do them to some extent forever, some of them we can just routinely do those sort of things. Others, they should be in our repertoire so we can switch them on if we have to.
I guess what's interesting about some of those things you mentioned is that for some people, they don't feel like a big deal. You know, if you wear masks, some people don't mind that. And what you describe as social distancing, you know, might sound okay to some people. There's another group in society for whom that sounds really, really frightening. And like a major societal shift that they didn't vote for and they don't want. I mean, some people really don't like looking around and not being able to see people's faces, and their children can't see people smiling and that kind of thing. So it really, really frightens people to talk about that kind of societal change.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would have a problem with being less crowded on tubes at rush hour, to be honest. I think the issue is masks. I think, you know, and what I realised from that comment was it's a real trigger for people. And I completely agree. I hate wearing masks. You know, I really hate it. And I think most people do. Although, interestingly, again, in Japan, you know, people say they actively like it. And I talked to one woman whose mother sleeps at night with a mask on because she feels more reassured by having a mask on. So they associate it with health and not getting ill. So it's a very different cultural kind of way of thinking about it.
So, but do you think we should be changing our culture then to be more?
We are where we are. I hope we don't have to wear face masks. But I think that if we are in a situation like we are at the moment, you know, where actually we're on a bit of a knife edge, we could go either way. You know, we can either, hopefully the vaccination rollout will be good and quick enough to not allow the Delta variant to get away, or it won't. And in this sort of situation where there's a threat, I think for people to wear masks in enclosed indoor spaces when we know it's transmitted by aerosol is really sensible. So when I was saying people could get used to, when they leave the house, checking, you know, do they have not only their keys and their phone, but also tissues? Again, when we were young, we always had tissues in our pocket. Hardly happens now. And if there's a potential threat around, if there looks like we're on the cusp of getting some kind of epidemic or pandemic, yeah, put the mask in your pocket in case you need to use it.
I'm really keen to get on to this question of where we are now and how we get out of it. But just to finish on this question, I mean, you used the phrase like population-wide cultural shifts and behavioural shifts. I think that might also be triggering for people. But in a way, the kind of central, what some people call conspiracy and other people just call fear, is that somehow this pandemic is being used as a way to change our society. And what you're saying really is that you would recommend that we should have new norms and that you think it should be a chance to change our society. So in a sense, they're right to be anxious.
I don't think I'm saying should. I think what I'm doing is raising questions about what people might want to do in the future. I don't think anybody has enjoyed these lockdowns. And I think it's a trade-off, isn't it? I do think that there should have been much more consultation with people right from the beginning to find out what kind of trade-offs people would like. But going back to the thing about wanting to change, you know, population-wide behaviour, these are kind of health and safety issues. I remember, I think you're probably too young to remember, I remember when there was an incredible furore about people wearing seatbelts. You know, that this was going to create more damage, that this was an infringement on individual liberties. It was passionate, you know, as passionate as, you know, some of the face mask discourse has been. Do you come across people now who object to wearing seatbelts? No, it's been adopted as an everyday kind of safe thing that everybody.
There is kind of a category difference, though, isn't there, between what you do when you're in the privacy of your own car to secure yourself versus suddenly, not seeing people's faces anymore as you walk around. It has a cultural impact, whilst seatbelts doesn't.
I completely agree, and I think that I don't think we will change to be like Japan and some of the Far East countries. But the reason that they are different is that they have had SARS, they have had many more threatening epidemics and pandemics with much more potentially serious consequences in terms of lethality. So there's a reason for that. I think that, as I said, I think the key thing is for people to be engaged in a discussion about options and for people to be informed about choices. All I can do is, if there is a goal for things, for people to change their behaviour, to think about how to make that easier for people, if that's what they want. It's not up to me to say, how things should be in the future. That's, a societal issue.
Do you think that's maybe at the core of why this has become such a heated controversy, that you're there as an expert providing advice on health and medical matters to the government? What you might be fine with, for example, more mask wearing and social distancing, other parts of the population might not be. So you're almost being brought into a political role. You're having more influence than maybe you signed up for.
I think it's really important that your listeners understand what the role is on SAGE, Scientific Advisory Group in Emergencies, and the behavioural group that I'm part of. We don't determine policy. We don't even advise on policy. We are posed questions, and then we provide the scientific evidence and thinking in answer to those questions. It's up to the policymakers and politicians what they decide. But one of the things that you will see, anybody who cares to go onto the government website and look at probably more than 50 papers that we've published over the last year, will see that many of our papers really emphasize this issue about engaging communities, respecting communities, listening to communities, and also about understanding individual differences. So you have such a range of people on all these issues as to what makes them comfortable or uncomfortable, what they think other people should or should not do. And absolutely crucial that these people are all engaged in conversations about it, and that differences between individuals, differences between social and cultural groups all get respected and understood.
Let's get into today then, Professor. We've got an announcement from the Prime Minister at 6 p.m. It's widely expected, I would say dead cert, from the briefings that he's going to delay the end of lockdown on the 21st by at least 4 more weeks. Is he making the right decision?
I don't think there's really any alternative other than delaying for 4 weeks and seeing what's happening. It's a very tricky situation. I don't envy anybody it has to take decisions in this situation, because you've got different things going in different directions. We have got these vaccine rollout that's going very well, very good take up. There are pockets where the take up is less good, but generally it's going very well. But it can only go as fast as it can go. Meanwhile, we have this Delta variant that is up to 60% more transmissible than the previous variant, which is huge. And we've seen steady, quite alarming increases in transmission rates over the last few weeks. Now we're beginning to see the predictable increase in hospitalisation. In that situation, you can't, lift restrictions without sending it into a kind of exponential spin upwards. So, yeah, I think he is right. I think the question is it going to be sufficient?
Is that a hint that you think it's going to be longer than 4 weeks in reality? I mean, some people have been saying that if the models are right, cases will be much higher in 4 weeks' time than they are today. And it seems politically hard to see how they're going to suddenly end all restrictions at that point.
Well, the Prime Minister very wisely said several weeks ago, we need to look at data, not dates. And I think he's absolutely right. And I think he and the government and everybody should really heed that advice and really think we can't predict. There's too many uncertainties in which way this kind of race between the vaccine and the variant may go. So I think 4 weeks, then review it and see where we are. That's all.
Do you have a sense, having looked at the data, of whether you think it's likely that 4 weeks will be enough, or do you suspect more might be needed?
I don't have a sense. But when I said the question is, does more need to be done? It wasn't more in terms of length of time. It was more in terms of right now. So there's a lot more we could be doing that would reduce transmission right now, and it's not being done, and that's frustrating. Such as ensuring that, for example, schools, which is where we're seeing the biggest rise in transmission at the moment, has good ventilation, that school children, secondary school children, do what they were doing previously, which is to wear face masks in enclosed indoor spaces, to ensure that there's very small bubbles within schools. And more generally, now that we know aerosol transmission is so important, that all shared public spaces, hospitality venues, for example, have got good ventilation. In Belgium, they are instituting carbon monoxide monitors so they can monitor as a proxy for how good the ventilation is. So that's something we could be doing right now. Have standards, have inspections, more regulation about having well ventilated indoor spaces.
Just to pick up on the schools point, so it's another one of those examples, isn't it, where it's not a zero cost move, because it's extremely uncomfortable and difficult for children to wear masks all day sitting in class. You talk about smaller bubbles, it means they can't play with their friends. It means that it's a material change to their whole experience. And during previous times when we had those restrictions, we saw numbers coming up anyway. So, some people on the ground who are watching kids playing and fiddling with masks and they're not wearing them properly anyway, sort of think that's a lot of bother for maybe not very much result.
You always have to look at the counterfactual. At the moment, we have got thousands of children at home isolating because somebody, in the school has, or in their bubble or whatever, has tested positive. Many of those children haven't been given digital access or laptops to continue their education. Children are really suffering. If you're at home, you don't have any contact with your friends. Plus, your parents have to stay at home and look after you, or one of them. That then raises real issues in terms of, productivity or people being concerned about losing their jobs. So there's knock-on effects. And there's none of this is there a perfect answer. Whatever way you go, there are going to be negative aspects to it. And yes, you're right to draw attention to it. But then you have to look at, if you don't do that, what's the alternative?
What about borders, Professor Michie, if I can bring you onto that? Is that something else you want to see dramatic, different action on than we're seeing at the moment?
I will say something on borders, and then there's something else which actually is the most important thing. Maybe you'll ask me about it. Borders has been, there have been criticisms about us being much too late coming to really having robust systems at borders in terms of people coming in. There are currently criticisms about the tiers of red, amber, green.
Would you join those? I mean, do you feel that they are inadequate?
I think if we'd had better border controls, we wouldn't have the Delta variant doing what it's doing at the moment. We were far too late to really restrict travel.
But at this point, though, it's in many, if not most, European countries, albeit less than ours. So it might seem odd to suddenly really end all travel to those countries because we've got higher infection rates and more of the Delta variant than they do.
I don't know any country who's stopped all travel. I think there's travel for work, there's travel for family reasons, etc. I think having a policy of encouraging people to holiday at home is a good idea. And one of the problems about the red, orange, red, amber, green is that people often come through third countries. And so they might have come from a green, but gone through a amber or red. And the other issue is not just about the country people have come from. If they've been in a large tourist resort, they'll be mixing with people from lots of other countries. There's also getting to the airport, being in the airport and the plane. Often people aren't segregated. So if you want to try and reduce transmission of problematic variants between people, that's an obvious.
So just so I understand that, is it the international travel worry, is that about the Delta variant? Or is that to try and avoid the importation of any other variants we don't yet know about?
The more transmission there is, the higher rates of transmission, the more mutations there are as the virus goes from one person to another. The more mutations, the more likely there are to be variants. The more variants, the more likely they are to be of concern and more transmissible. So keeping transmission levels at a really low level is what's needed if you don't want to produce your own new variants. And we obviously produced a variant that is now called the Alpha variant last year. There's that issue, but there's also an issue about a two-way thing, about we shouldn't be happy to be transporting our variant across the world.
It's partly to protect other countries then.
Yeah, exactly. And also, we've seen to our cost what happens when we don't have more robust border controls ourselves.
The point that people will raise in response to that is there will always be other variants, and the end point of having minimal circulation of COVID-19 across the whole world is at this point quite far away. So the logical deduction of what you're saying is that if we impose those kind of travel restrictions you're suggesting, they're there also for the long term, or you might say forever.
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say that is when we are facing a very serious threat, which we are at the moment, where hundreds or thousands of people may lose their lives at worst case scenario. And in that situation, one wants to think about what are all the things that can be done to prevent that and to prevent this virus running away again as it did before Christmas, and prevent having any other very serious restrictions.
So you wouldn't see tighter travel restrictions as part of a long-term shift?
I think it's very difficult to know how it's going to go. What I do hope is that this brings countries together more, and there's a more global way of looking at travel, because actually there's an existential crisis around the corner, which is much greater than pandemics, and that's the climate crisis. And air travel is one of the big contributors to global warming and the kind of problems we've already been seeing.
So do you want to see, so just on that, one good reason in your view to have less international travel is that it also helps the global warming question?
Absolutely. And, I'm an academic, and myself and other people have been in situations where we're flown all over the world to give a keynote lecture, and then we fly back again, to the States, to Australia, to wherever. Also, academics have meetings where we fly all around the world. We don't need to. We found out that a lot of what we've been doing by flying around the world, we can do, as you and I are doing now, have a conversation over Zoom.
Won't you miss meeting your colleagues in other universities in this new future?
There are certain things where Zoom is no substitute. So conferences, academic conferences, I organise our own one, and I attend others that are on Zoom. It's not the same, because actually the important thing about academic conferences is talking to people over lunch, over drink in the evening. That's when you get a lot of the really interesting new ideas and new collaborations formed. And that's true for everyone. I mean, we are social animals. We love being with each other. And so we should. But all I'm saying is that not all of the travel is like that. I'd say in the academic world, at least 2/3 could be replaced with this sort of interaction. So you asked me about what we could be doing to reduce the current problems, and we've talked about changing the way we do things, our kind of behaviour. We've talked about border controls. I've talked about making safe places, which I think is big. But there's another one, which is an absolute cornerstone of pandemic control, which is what other countries who are now leading relatively normal lives did extremely well. And that is a test, trace, and isolate system. And we in this country have done really badly. We've poured, I think it's 38 billion or so, a huge amount of money into this, but not into ways in which we know it works, which is run by local public health organisations who know their local communities, who are trusted by their communities. So we have a situation still, after all this time, where tests take too long, where there aren't tracers on the ground, as there are in other countries, even relatively poorer countries. People going round door to door, finding out who's been in touch with who, etc. And people aren't isolating. Only our own research data shows that only about half people, even when they have symptoms of COVID, don't isolate at home for a whole variety of reasons. But this is a failed system. And if we want to be serious about controlling the pandemic, we need to sort that out.
What would you say to the response that if you cast your mind 12 months ago, during the first summer of COVID, test, trace, and isolate was all anyone was talking about? We were envious of the German system. Everyone thought they had designed it so well. All across Europe, people were pouring money into test, trace, and isolate. And to my knowledge, there's not a single country across Europe where that was effective enough to dampen or prevent the second wave that then just spread all the way across Europe. What's that evidence point telling us about that?
Yeah, I don't know about what the different European countries have been doing. But the countries that have done it really well are those, again, where they've had experiences of pandemics many times. So, the Southeast Asian countries have done very well in terms of test, trace, and isolate. I know, for example, Kerala in India did very well. Uruguay in South America has done well. Certain countries have done very well. There's no panacea. There's nothing that's going to say this can prevent this happening. But what it has been able to do in those countries, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, very different kinds of countries, Vietnam, Thailand, etc. What they can do is reduce the scale of the problem. And what it can do is buy time, for other things, especially vaccinations, to come along.
And with it, of course, we come back to that idea of societal change, because it means checking in with a barcode everywhere you go. It means being traced and tracked and getting notifications and being told to stay at home and living your life on the edge of constantly coming into contact with, you're being, busted by the app. And a lot of people don't want to live like that.
Most countries don't have apps. How it's done varies a lot. But the key thing is that people get test results back quickly. So it minimizes the time they wander around the community being infectious, and that they have people who are skilled that they can talk to and work out where they might have got this from. So backward tracing, as well as forward tracing. Who have I been in touch with that I might have infected? So those are things that are really important. The isolation, many countries, including the countries I talked about, which are a lot poorer than our country, offer alternative accommodation. None of that's happened here. If someone's infected,
and some countries actually weld people in. We've heard that happened in China, a country that I think you've praised their pandemic response, but to a lot of people in a liberal democracy, they think that's going too far, even if it is effective.
Let's look at New York City. if you'd like to take that as an example, they provide, if anybody is either tested positive, got symptoms or contact, they provide free local hotel accommodation, free meals, free Wi-Fi, your children could go if needs be, free transport there and back, even pet care. This is the sort of thing that you do if you're serious about separating those who are isolated from those who are not. Most people in this country haven't got the kind of housing where you can isolate yourself within a household, and therefore the chances are that you'll infect other people in your household.
Although then we got law of unintended consequences again, Professor Michie, because there are lots of examples of outbreaks in those centres. We had one in Australia, a special COVID isolation centre became an outbreak centre, and there were other examples around the world. So is there not a danger that these elaborate, more sort of invasive schemes end up producing their own dangers?
When you say lots, there have been very few. And what's been really impressive, when they've occurred, they've been jumped on and they've been managed and dealt with. How do they do that? Through a really good test, trace and isolate system, and sometimes a regional, very short term, week or 2 weeks lockdown, which they've done, for example, in the city of Melbourne before. Now, that means that when any outbreak occurs, which it will do, it will, like measles, we have to live with measles and we get measles outbreaks. What's important is there's a system in place that can immediately find out who's been infected, who might be infected, and sort the problem. And that's what's been happening. We don't have that in place to do that. So there's so many things in the UK we could be doing that could help us get out of this pandemic in 4 weeks' time, which is what we'd all like to do.
I mean, Melbourne's been sort of in and out of lockdowns all along, hasn't it, in response to these? Let me ask you, Professor, the UK, in theory, is the dream scenario in that we have lots of vaccine, we have very little vaccine hesitancy. As you mentioned, it's in the mid-90s, whilst if you cross the channel, it's more like in the mid-50s. The chances of France getting to even the point we are now seem remote. But so we've got everything going for us. We're supposed to be ahead of everyone else. We've vaccinated 80% of adults. This was the cavalry coming over the hill, as the Prime Minister described it. And I think a lot of people will just be quite flabbergasted that we've reached this point and it's still not enough. So if the UK can't start relaxing with all of those things in its favour, what's the rest of the world ever going to do?
I don't think the UK, I mean, yes, it's got the advantage of vaccines that the NHS has rolled out really quickly. I don't think the UK, anybody would hold the UK up as a great example of pandemic response in this pandemic. I think it's been actually one of the least good, for all the reasons I've talked about. If we hadn't had the Delta variant becoming the dominant variant as it has, if we'd had better border controls and not imported and seeded it in the way we had, we might have been all right. We might have been out of this. And it is really frustrating for everybody to know that, had we done things differently, we could be in a very different place. We should have been in a very different place. And it is frustrating.
Let me end, if I may, by asking a little bit about the nexus of politics and expertise, because that's what all of this comes from. One detail that I'm sure you're fed up with by now, but every Daily Mail article and other thing leads with huge excitement, is that you were or remain a member of the Communist Party. Is that true? Are you a communist?
My politics are not anything to do with my scientific advice. And I've never discussed my politics with people like yourself. So nor am I going to now. The important thing is that when one gives scientific advice, one does so using the expertise one has, not going beyond the expertise, being transparent about what expertise you provide. And I think that the kind of articles you referred to are a really disturbing kind of McCarthyite witch hunting, which I don't think should have any place in a liberal, tolerant society.
Fair enough. So if we make it a more general observation, then do you see in the throes of this conversation, do you see any correlation between those experts that are more comfortable with larger collectivist, state-led interventions and a kind of left of centre politics, and a more laissez-faire, small government sort of right of centre politics? Do you think inevitably those kind of ideas do end up creeping into policy ideas in the end?
If you look at the publications coming out from the behavioural group of SAGE, many of them talk about the problems of inequality in our society and the dangers of inequalities, the fact that the pandemic itself and the response have increased those inequalities, and the need to reduce inequalities. And there's a large group on we call it SPI-B, on the behavioural science group, and we never talk about each other's politics. I assume there's a very broad range, but everybody's unanimous about wanting a more equal society. And in order to get a fairer and more just society, it does require the government that's been elected to have policies that reduce rather than increase inequalities.
I mean, and just to be clear, I wasn't trying to embarrass you or make it a personal point. It's just, we're in a strange world where politics and science have got very close all of a sudden. And I guess I wonder, do you regret that? Do you wish that things were more?
I think there is a sort of ideological difference, I suppose, with public health science taking a more population-wide view of things. How do we deal with this across the population? How do we deal with this as a society? How do we make things less unequal and fairer? And that is a different kind of emphasis coming from public health, population health science, to what I don't see a lot of amongst my colleagues maybe, but certainly the media, and especially the papers that you mentioned, would have much more emphasis on individual freedom, individual rights, rather than taking a sort of more collective population approach. But the reality is that this pandemic has shown everybody that no individual is an island. We're very interconnected, and no one community or no one sort of socioeconomic group within society can think that they can solve it for themselves and protect themselves, because it's not like that. And similarly, no country is an island. All countries are interconnected. And one of the things we haven't talked about, which is incredibly important going forward, is getting the whole world vaccinated, and how we do that and the steps that need to be taken. It's very good to see millions of vaccinations being donated, but the key thing is enabling countries to be able to afford vaccinations themselves by waiving the patent costs at this time of crisis, which is what happened during the AIDS epidemic, and also supporting all countries to be able to develop the expertise and infrastructure, not all countries can be, but more countries, to develop vaccines, because we can't put up a border around us forever. It's just not realistic. We're an interconnected global society. And so, we can only solve this problem across society and indeed across the world.
Professor Susan Michie, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Been good to talk to you.
That was Professor Susan Michie of University College London, one of the more influential voices advising the government here in the UK on COVID policy. Really fascinating to get her view there on the dovetailing of ideology and science, and how we are or are not going to change our society going forward. Thanks to her, and thanks for watching. This was Lockdown TV.